Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Medal of Honor European Assault for PlayStation 2, Xbox, and GameCube. What you're seeing here is the GameCube version. This is a first-person shooter and the 8th game in the Medal of Honor series. It was developed by EA Los Angeles and published by Electronic Arts in 2005 for PlayStation 2, Xbox, and GameCube. And at the time, it didn't get a particularly great reception. In fact, a lot of people seem to think it was either average or outright weak, with particular criticism leveled at the difficulty as well as the lack of online multiplayer, and of course the problem of it being a World War II shooter and not being particularly realistic, because clearly that's a big problem. I mean, clearly Medal of Honor is the Paragon series of hyper-realistic war games that does every single thing justice, and totally doesn't have you playing Rambo mixed with James Bond all the time. In case you can't tell, that was sarcasm. But I digress. I do have to give you a bit of a disclaimer here, because I actually did play this back in the day. It was a few months after it was released, but it was still within a year of the game's release. So I did play this when it was still contemporary, and now I'm basically going back to it and seeing if what I thought about it back then still holds up. Which, as it turns out, it actually does. So let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out what exactly we're dealing with here. Well, as far as presentation goes, it definitely looks rather dated by modern standards, but then again, that's pretty much to be expected. I mean, the game did come out over a decade ago at this point, and it was going for a relatively realistic art style. There are a lot of jagged edges, there's some fairly blocky modeling, although it's nowhere near as bad as Frontline was. The texture quality is generally fairly low res, and there's really not all that much in the way of particle effects or really cool shader effects or anything of that nature going on in this thing. But luckily, EA Los Angeles actually got the memo and found out people were actually really sick of that horrendous muted colors of brown and gray and realistic that was going on at the time, and instead they went with something that actually looks more realistic. There's still a lot of brown and gray, don't get me wrong, but there's more color to it than that, and the lighting really does help in that regard. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's still not aesthetically all that great, but at least it's not anywhere near as bad as the dour, boring nonsense we got in the likes of, say, Medal of Honor, Frontline, or Call of Duty Finest Hour. So if nothing else, at least in the color scheme, it's a step in the right direction. But when you go into things like the animations, for example, that's where things get really hit or miss, because some of them are actually fairly decent, and then others, like some of the weapon handling animations, really are not very good at all. The game does have some rather nice recoil animations, so whenever you take shots with the various weapons you have, it does kick around a pretty decent amount, and it makes it look more powerful, but a lot of the reloading animations are simply not accurate to the weapons being used, and of course they don't have any distinction between when you have an empty magazine and when you have a semi-empty magazine, so that's certainly disappointing. But then there's things like the lip syncing, which makes all of the characters look like they're fish trying to breathe, which certainly is not that big of a deal given when this game came out, but even then it is still a bit jarring sometimes. But then you move into the sound design, and that's where things start to heat up. First, because the music in this game, while certainly very much a World War II movie-style soundtrack, is still really well done. So even though the style was pretty stale by the time this game came out, and it's even more stale now, at least the music is of sufficiently high quality. Then of course there's the voice acting, which overall is fairly solid, although the Russians have some pretty goofy accents going on, which given that this is a game circa 2005, that's really not that surprising. But then there's the sound effects. This is the only game in the entire Medal of Honor series to absolutely nail a lot of the weapon sounds. You see, they didn't simply reuse sound effects from previous games like they did with, say, Medal of Honor Frontline and Rising Sun. Instead, they decided to go ahead and make new sound effects for this. And the results are as follows. No, my friends, your ears did not deceive you. This game actually has beefy gun sound effects. And you may not necessarily think, oh hey, well the gun sound effects don't really mean all that much to the grand scheme of the presentation. Actually, they do. Because when you combine those sound effects with the really punchy recoil animations and the actual damage output those various guns have, you end up with, oddly enough, the most satisfying gunplay in the entire Medal of Honor series. And that of course leads me into what really matters here, because presentation-wise, this thing is mostly just solid for its time, apart from the rather beefy gun sound effects. And what ultimately matters here is story, but more importantly, the gameplay. But before I start talking about the gameplay, let's go ahead and go over the storyline in this. You play as Lieutenant William Holt, a member of OSS who is working alongside a lot of different factions during the events of World War II, and it starts out with a fictionalized account of the raid on Saint-Nazaire. From there you end up moving on into the North Africa campaign and working alongside the British, then you move on into the Soviet Union during the Battle of Stalingrad, and then finally you move on into the Battle of the Bulge. It's pretty obvious that they were influenced by the Call of Duty series' multiple campaigns from multiple perspectives. Instead of doing that, however, they decided to stick with only the one guy, who as it turns out is pretty much a superhero. Because throughout the course of the campaign, even though you do have AI squad mates, you'll mostly be wiping out the enemy entirely by yourself. What's that? A couple of panzers are holding down an entire battalion by themselves? Better send in Holt, he can take both of them out in a jiffy. Deeply entrenched enemy position? Who needs airstrikes when you've got Holt? He's a one-man army. You see, the game has a bit of an interesting dichotomy because, on the one hand, it does pay some degree of lip service to the actual events of World War II, because there are cutscenes in between the missions that give you some documentary footage and give you some degree of history regarding the actual events of World War II. But at the same time, it is constantly trying to push home the idea of heroism. The problem is that it does that in a very heavy-handed manner. It puts the entirety of the war on the player's shoulders rather than making it a wider effort, like say the Call of Duty series did, where it puts you in the shoes of one guy who was caught up in something much bigger than he was. And that was where moments of individual heroism would come into play, because people would brave the machine gun fire and the artillery barrages and such to bring their buddies back and keep their buddies alive. The thing is, that's a more realistic route to take. Medal of Honor European Assault does not care. And really the major problem with that is that it's trying to pass its story off as something fairly serious, but you've got completely absurd things going on throughout the course of the gameplay. The thing is, this actually doesn't become that big of a problem because it turns out that the game is almost exclusively focused on gameplay to begin with. To sum it up, this really does not play very much like a traditional Medal of Honor title. You can see where they took elements from the previous Medal of Honor games and put them in this, but they put their own spin on it, and it's something that the rest of the series didn't really do. For example, you still have to pick up health packs, but instead of those going directly into repairing your health meter, they actually go into your inventory, and then you can use them when you need them later, and you can also use those to heal your squad mates. Of course, those aren't the only healing items you'll come across. You will occasionally come across healing items that do instantly go into refilling your health meter, but those are for a considerably smaller amount of health. On top of the change to the health pack system, they introduced the idea of revives. You see, instead of simply dying, if you have a revive available, then you will instantly revive with about a quarter to a half of your health meter full. You can complete various side objectives to get more revives, so you can actually make quite a lot of mistakes and still come out on top. And because the health system ends up being more forgiving in that manner, they actually amplified the difficulty. The game will actually throw quite a lot more enemies than you're necessarily used to for a Medal of Honor game at you, and it actually ends up ramping up the difficulty to a point where it's acceptable. A lot of people will complain that the game is too hard because it doesn't have checkpoints. The thing is, it doesn't need checkpoints. The revive system and the health pack system give you all of the resources you need to be able to finish a level. And as long as you don't play like a complete moron, you should be able to get through the level with those resources. In fact, you pretty much have to go out of your way to fail miserably enough that you need to restart the level entirely. This is because not only does it give you plenty of health packs and plenty of revives throughout the course of the campaigns, but it also gives you plenty of weapons and ammo, and those weapons have quite a powerful effect on target. There is not a single gun in this entire game that feels weak. There are a few that aren't particularly accurate, and some of them are a bit weaker than others, but none of them outright feel weak because they all do quite a lot of damage. And it also helps that the aiming is actually fairly smooth in this. Now, it's certainly more sluggish than what you would get on PC, but it doesn't feel jumpy like the previous Medal of Honor console titles. And it being a lot smoother and more consistent means it's a lot easier to aim properly, although you still have some trouble when enemies move around because you can actually not aim as quickly as they can react. But the weapons being powerful, along with the previously mentioned recoil animations being rather punchy, as well as the sound effects for almost all of the guns in the game sounding rather powerful, means that the gunplay ends up being rather satisfying, particularly for a console shooter, but especially for a Medal of Honor title. In fact, about the only things holding the gunplay back are the 2-weapon limit as well as the console controls. It's on a gamepad that is inherently going to be a lot more sluggish and a lot less precise than a PC keyboard and mouse. And while the 2-weapon limit was becoming very standard for console shooters at the time and arguably works better for console, it does make you wonder what the game would be like without the sluggishness of the controls on a gamepad. But even with the limitations of the gamepad, it ends up being very satisfying gunplay that is, like I said, the absolute most satisfying in the entire Medal of Honor series. And that is helped in no small part by the adrenaline feature, which was new to Medal of Honor European Assault and is basically where Holt gets his superpowers. In fact, it always amuses me when I look at the back of the box here and I see new adrenaline feature, Unleash the Hero Within. You see, the adrenaline feature is quite simple. It's a meter that builds up as you get headshots and melee kills, and it eventually allows you to trigger the adrenaline mode, which makes you immune to damage, gives you infinite ammunition, and zooms in the view, and it also slows down time. In other words, you become an unstoppable juggernaut of death. But only for a limited time, and then you have to go back and start building up that meter again. So basically, you'll end up reserving that for moments where you really need it, or you just feel like cutting loose and having some fun. And I think that's something that really bothered a lot of people when this game came out, because they were expecting, much like the previous Medal of Honor games, which all take themselves ridiculously seriously and act like they're supposed to be some realistic war game, when in reality they're completely absurd. European Assault, on the other hand, is the only game in the entire series to actually embrace the absurdity. The problem is that it only really does that mechanically, because as far as level objectives go, they're the same kind of thing you'd be seeing in just about any other World War II shooter. Go to a location, plant a charge, maybe you take out a tank or two, and you go to another point, you hold that position until the enemy stops spawning in, things like that. Along the way, you will be given access to various secondary objectives that will allow you to get more revives, and those can be things like take out a particular enemy that's going to be a lot tougher than the other enemies. But other than that, there's really not all that much variety to the game. You're infantry the entire game. There's basically nothing in there to shake that up. And on certain levels, things do slow down and eventually become a bit monotonous. Now, of course, the game is about 8 or so hours long, so even on the levels that do slow down and become a bit monotonous, they're not so long that it becomes really irritating, but it is still really disappointing that there's not more variety. It's also rather disappointing that the gameplay doesn't really match up all that well with the storyline. Like I said, and as far as gameplay mechanics go, they embraced the absurdity of the series and said, screw it, we're making something that's kind of an arcadey shooter that's just going to be fun. Meanwhile, on the plot side of things, they try to take things more seriously and it just ends up falling flat. But even with that problem, they were moving in the right direction with the Medal of Honor series with European Assault. They were starting to take it less seriously, they were starting to give it more of a gameplay focus, and that was actually working out really well for European Assault in the long run. The problem is that experimentation ended with European Assault, and as a result, it's the only game in the entire series that, despite still having some degree of an identity crisis, still manages to come across as having a coherent vision for what a Medal of Honor game should be. Which is, this series started off with you playing basically a combination of Rambo and James Bond, so why don't we embrace that? Meanwhile, the other games in the series basically try to say, hey, look at me, I'm a realistic war game, when they're nothing remotely resembling realistic. Now, that's not to say that the game's perfect, not by a long shot, but the fact that it opens up the levels a bit more for you to mess around with, giving you optional objectives that you can complete, the fact that you can make a lot of mistakes before going down, the fact that you can feel like a total badass when you go into adrenaline mode and just mow down hordes upon hordes of enemies in one fell swoop, and doing a ton of damage to the enemy even when you're not in adrenaline mode just simply makes this a lot more fun than all of the other Medal of Honor games combined. It's just a real shame that they just kept shoveling out crap after crap in this series after this instead of capitalizing on what actually made this game worth playing. In fact, this is one of only 2 games in the entire series that I can actually recommend on any level. The other one is the original Medal of Honor, and that is purely for the historical significance it had in popularizing World War II shooters. But this is the only game in the entire Medal of Honor series that is legitimately worth playing as a first-person shooter. I give it a 3.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.